I've investigated a lot of money laundering, and we're talking big sums of money. That same system, that same 3 phases of placement, layering, integration, you can use to clean up dirty money, and you can also use to clean information or to obscure the original origin of some information and make it look completely legitimate.
I have critical sway here. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah. Hey, Tom. Thanks very much for having me on. Feel free to call me Paul. Critical Sway, obviously, my online moniker, but I'll let my first name at least leak out. So I was just saying before we started that I was going to make the joke early in the piece here that, on the question of climate science, I'm probably the least well-read or credentialed guest to ever appear on your show here, Tom. But if you bear with me, I think I can make a case for that being a good thing.
Good. Let's go for it.
All right, here we go. So if I wind the clock back a little bit, and I really want to put this in perspective, I was a high school dropout, right? So 16 years of age, failed the 10th grade and, chucked high school in and went and got a job. And actually, if I think about that from a point of view of, my science knowledge, I remember having a particular disdain for my science teacher, and I probably cut that class more often than not. So even to say I've got a 10th grade understanding of science is probably a little bit of a stretch. But, after school, a couple of random jobs, and then I end up as a career in law enforcement, which has spanned a couple of different areas that I think kind of inform my perspective now. So I worked my way up. I worked as a criminal investigator, and I've worked on some, serious and organised crime groups. And then I've also spent time working as a covert intelligence operative, which explains why, I tell you only my first name and I don't put my image up on the screen. It's actually, as a little bit of a side topic, it's not so much a safety issue for me as it would be for the people that I spoke with who I dealt with on an understanding of secrecy. So, I don't put my head on the TV or put my real face on social media. But I guess I'd draw the distinction, those two areas that I worked in. If you work as a criminal investigator, you kind of get a good idea of how criminals operate, but the perspective you're coming from is from the outside looking in, right? And then having a career as a covert operative, working covert criminal intelligence, you actually infiltrate those groups and sit down with the people, the people that you're actually investigating, and you sort of learn how they work, working from, looking from the inside and how things really operate on the inside of those groups. And I found that the only way you really survive in that zone is by studying human behavior and getting pretty good at working out what are people's incentives and what makes them tick, and using those as a pretty good yardstick for the truth, right? And to work out, what are people likely to do next, and having a reasonable degree of accuracy in predicting that. So if I tie that back to, when I'm talking about, climate matters as an example, I'm not, if I'm brutally honest with you, I'm not great with complex calculations. If you give me a ream of graphs or, endless data and studies and, boatloads of numbers, I can work through it, but it's not really my natural zone of comfort, right? And I think that's probably true for a lot of people. And I think it probably excludes a lot of people from these discussions because they start to get an interest in this stuff. Everyone's hearing about climate change and, I don't mind going on record and calling it climate hysteria at this point. And I'm sure that won't upset any of your listeners, Tom. But, people are put off because they don't really understand it. But I think that maybe what I can bring is that, from a perspective of human behavior, which is something that anyone can understand, I write about, the incentives and what's likely driving these things from behind the scenes. And I feel like for some people, that's a little bit more approachable. So that's kind of, the approach that I'm taking with my writing with critical sway. And that's my argument for why maybe it's good to have someone who's not so, technically credentialed or so deep in the science to talk more so about just the incentives and the way that, human behavior might be being driven behind the scenes.
That sounds great. I think we need to hear your perspective on this. I would like to know why you're called critical sway.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, as you would know, Tom, you decide to start some sort of online profile and you need to find one that's not taken. So that's step number one and the most obvious one. But I ended up with critical sway because the two words, it's like critical, and it's like, on one hand, I'll try and quote a dictionary definition. I don't have it in front of me, but it's basically like, with decisive importance with respect to the outcome, right? Like it's really important. It's also critical in terms of like critical thinking where like, people need to be thinking beyond the slogans and beyond the rhetoric and the propaganda that gets put in front of them on a daily basis. And, I wanted to encourage that sort of thing. So that's critical. And then, the sway side of things is more about like, it's a word about influence, right? It's about, people's behavior being moved one way or the other, which I think is like a really big part of this whole kind of climate crisis narrative, is just about swaying people without them really having done a whole lot of thinking about it for themselves.
I found you on Twitter. Is that the place where you're most active? And you have a website as well, criticalsway.com?
Yeah, so Twitter is the place where I started this whole thing, and that's kind of like the central point of contact. That's where I spend my most time. And then criticalsway.com's got my weekly newsletter on it, and that's where I kind of post up articles and little bits and pieces that I'm working on as well. But yeah, Twitter at Critical Sway is definitely the best place to find me.
So do you want to kind of dive in and talk about your work on climate and energy here?
Let me just go back one step, right? So my work with Critical Sway, and I'll make the point that actually the climate thing was not my first point of focus, but I want to explain how I got there because I think it will make sense to people. So the whole idea behind Critical Sway is, and it is my tagline, right, is I want to generate intelligence for the people. And, the motto is like harder to fool and harder to rule. So I'm like, people are not as easily misled, then they're not as easily ruled. And, I'm a freedom kind of advocate, and I want to see more of that sort of stuff. I suppose it's a libertarian kind of viewpoint that I come from. And so I want people to be well informed, so they're a little bit harder to take off track. So that's harder to fool and harder to rule. People sometimes ask me, Tom, like, why did I switch teams? Because I say, like, I used to generate intelligence for the government and now I generate intelligence for the people. And I just argue back and say, well, actually, I didn't switch teams. Everything I've done has been just trying to work out what's true. It's just a question of who do I write it up for, you know what I mean? So I'm still doing the same thing I always was. I just sort of like got a different boss, as a way to say it. So what happened for me was that, like, that work that I was doing, particularly the intelligence work's pretty, it's like high adrenaline, it's high intensity. Your phone's on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And like I've used that, the old frog in the pot analogy, like you put the frog in that pot full of cold water and just start warming it up slowly and doesn't realize all of a sudden he's boiling, right? So I think I was there, and then I met my wife while I was doing that work, and I had a kid. I've got a little boy now, he's 18 months old, and it was time to sort of get away from that world. And what actually happened to me is I broke my leg severely in what I would lie and say was an impressive skateboard accident, but it was actually a not very impressive skateboard accident. But I did a real number on my leg and needed some metal plates and the surgery, and I knew I was going to have about 4 months sitting on the couch. And so I'm sort of sitting there reading about, the various things that are kind of like of interest to me. Like, I'm interested in the financial system. I was interested in the whole COVID response, which was, obviously at its peak right around that time, and, health and well-being and money and all these things that, like, quite frankly, most people have no idea about these things, and they don't even know where to start to approach them, right? So for me, it's interesting. I'm reading about those kind of things, and I decided to, like, dust off the keyboard, and try and leave a few breadcrumbs for whoever's coming behind me to see, are there people out there who can benefit from my perspective, So that's sort of where the whole Critical Sway thing started. And the real point of focus for me right across it has been that, like, there's this real danger inherent in any time we have, like, a centralized system of control. So and that sometimes I write about central banking from this point of view, or I write about the World Economic Forum from this point of view, or, the World Health Organization, or certain philanthropists that have very powerful, ability to lobby the narrative and, change the direction of things. It wasn't, like I was saying, it wasn't really a climate focused thing for me. But as you go on, you realize you can't ignore it. This hysteria has reached such a pitch that it just cuts across everything in all of those industries, in the financial industry and in our health decisions, and everything the UN's doing, everything the World Health Organization's doing, everything the World Economic Forum's doing, I'll say, like, that whole climate crisis hysteria is like a SDG fueled, like a globalist honeypot, right? Like the sustainable development goals are the way you can just pay for anything, if you can tie it back to one of those. So that's really where my interest in that whole kind of like climate narrative and what you might call the climate battle, that sort of stuff came up for me, because it just continued to cut across all those other things that I was looking at.
What do you think is motivating the people at the top? Or do you want to start talking about that yet, about what's going on in the minds of the people at the COP meetings, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that I like to say that money's not actually what makes the world go round. I don't believe that. I think incentives are what makes the world go around. But most of what we do, in pursuit of our incentives, and most of what we do to sort of like measure the things that we do, it's measured in money, right? It's measured in dollars. And I think that, at the highest levels, it is financial motivations that are driving most of these things. And sometimes, people will talk about, systems of control, or, wanting to oppress a population, or, have these authoritarian type of ideas. But I think they do boil down to that incentive to really make money for those elite few. And I think that is what's at the top of all of those agencies that I've already spoken about.
Do you think people at these meetings sincerely think that they're preventing bad weather, or is that a pretty rare sentiment and it's way more about money?
I think people can be pretty blinded by money. So you could probably be generous and say that some of these people are fully bought in and they believe that what they're doing is noble. I think there's probably only, at the pointy end, a handful of people who are genuinely sinister in what they're trying to do. And then as you come down the pyramid a little bit, so to speak, I think you get more and more into people who probably turn up to work and, do their jobs as well as they can, but the system that they're set up in is driving them down that road.
And how long have you been looking into the climate issue itself, climate and energy? Is it just since the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think it really is the last couple of years. I mean, prior to that, Tom, it wasn't really a point of focus for me. I suppose, professional career, I've worked around, I've worked in serious and organised crime groups. I've done a lot of work around money laundering, and it was things that related to that, international drug trafficking and things of that nature that I was looking at. And it was really, like I said, that, I came across and start thinking about these kind of centralized points of control and, the narratives that were coming out of those places. And then you just see that, the climate hysteria is just dominating all of them. And that is really when I started to think, well, best I get an informed opinion on this, and I started to look at it more over the last year or two.
What was your approach to become more informed on it? You said you don't delve heavily into the deep weeds of the science, right?
Yeah, I mean, I try to read that stuff, Tom, and I do my best to understand it. But like I say, my educational background in that field, I can't. Some of it I don't understand, and I think the average person needs to have some sort of filter they can throw over it to work out which experts to trust. Because there are genuine experts. If you're going to try and become an expert on everything that's important in the world, you're sort of going to be a jack of all trades, and you're going to succeed at none of them. Where I think that you can take that filter of incentives and the human behaviour kind of element and paint that over anyone you're listening to, and start to try and figure out, well, who are the people that are, that have the right incentives, who are aligned to giving me information that's true, and who are the people who are maybe set to profit from this honeypot and might be saying something that suits their own interests a lot more than it suits mine.
Yeah, I think that the average person never does need to learn atmospheric physics at all to sanity check this, that if they're telling us that crops are failing, that all you have to do is look at the actual data to see how the crops are doing. And I think we can do a lot of sanity checking on our own without ever getting way down into the weeds.
There's a fair bit of common sense if you just stick your head out the window, right? We've all been here for at least a few decades, and some of us a few more. And you think, well, I seem to remember summer being hot when I was a kid, and it's still hot now. And I remember winter being cold when I was a kid, and it's still cold now. And that we've got decades of predictions from various leading voices on these matters, and all these doomsday predictions over 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they're consistently not correct. We're all still here. So I think you can say, well, okay, maybe we don't need to be such, doomsday mongers in all of this.
So you have heavily looked into or thought about the incentives for people to sell the climate hysteria? That's part of what you've done?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I wrote a piece, I might touch on a couple of points from this, but I wrote a piece about Bill Gates and breakthrough energy ventures, which I imagine you might be familiar with, but that's his kind of his new energy kind of vehicle, that he's making his investments through. And so this piece I wrote for thelibertyforum.org, which is Matt Gubber started this thing. He's from the UK. He started this thing with the idea of the World Economic Forum, the WEF have way too much control of the narrative and we need to push back a little bit, and he reached out to me and asked me to write some pieces for his site, which I've done. And one of them was this piece I called The Philanthropist's Playbook, which is it's easy to type, but it's hard to say. The Philanthropist's Playbook, which is really about this whole thing where, certain people will put themselves forward as, being engaged in charity and doing things for, the betterment of humanity and to fix the planet and all that sort of stuff. And we're going to give away all of our wealth. And I went, well, does this make any sense? Because if you take Bill Gates as just one example, he is richer now than he was a year ago and 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And all this money he's giving away doesn't seem to be depleting his personal wealth. And then I thought, well, can we demonstrate these activities that some of these philanthropists are engaged in are actually profiting them? And is there a financial motive behind it? I started with an open mind to this, but I'll give you one example from Bill Gates personally. So He runs, obviously the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation fund a lot of health-related ventures around the world, right? But they say that they don't directly fund climate initiatives. That they deal with health issues that flow from the climate catastrophe or whatever wording they're going to use. It's nicer than that, but they don't directly fund climate initiatives. But then the World Health Organization definitely have climate-related initiatives, right? And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the largest funder that's not a nation state in the world, largest funder to the World Health Organization. And in fact, even if you line them up against all the various countries, all the nations that donate money to the World Health Organization, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the second highest funder overall. The only entity in the world paying more money into the WHO is Germany. So then every other country follows the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So there's a huge amount of money going in there, right? So they will say that they don't, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is not trying to influence the climate narratives, but then they'll pay the World Health Organization who do that. So let me go back a step here, right? So Bill Gates has this holding company called Breakthrough Energy Ventures that he founded. There's other shareholders involved in it, right? But they've basically got a lot of kind of like moonshot investments. They're having a crack at all sorts of different alternative energy type ideas. Bill says, well, I'm not going to make any money out of this personally, right? I don't want you to think I'm making bank from this. So any profits I make out of Breakthrough Energy Ventures, I'll just give it to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation donate their money wherever they choose to donate. And one of the large places is the WHO, right? And then the WHO push, they're well on board with this kind of like climate, alarmism, and they push all sorts of things around that. What Bill doesn't mention in any of his sort of materials is that he actually has a heap of shares in this company called Waste Management Inc. Waste Management Inc. it's either the biggest or the second biggest waste management company in the US, right? Bill's got, and I'm just going to look at some numbers here so I don't misquote this, right? So 16% of his entire share portfolio is made up of this Waste Management Inc., right? So it's a huge holding. So that holding, when I did these sums, this might have changed a little bit. So when I did these sums, a share was $159 a share. He held 35 million of them, which means he's got about a $5.5 billion holding in that company. So this is huge, right? Why am I talking about this in the context of what we're talking about here? So Waste Management Inc. have this unique structure where they run their rubbish trucks on natural gas. So they've got natural gas powered fleet of trucks, right? They go and pick up your garbage, take your garbage to their waste disposal facility. Garbage that's decomposing releases methane. They capture the methane, compress it, and then use the methane to power the trucks and use the rest of the methane to power electricity production, which they sell back onto the grid. So this company obviously is in this kind of like, less carbon emitting kind of space where they say, well, yeah, it's still natural gas, but it's not coal, it's not oil, and it's creating a lot less CO2 when we burn it. If you think about those numbers I said before about the shares and the amount of value that Bill Gates holds in that company, let's do some quick like back of the napkin numbers, right? Like, so, like sort of like back of the envelope or whatever you want to call it. So let's just say some organization in the world is pushing this really powerful narrative that around like carbon emissions, one that like maybe, for example, like the WHO is pushing, for example. Let's just say you could work out that drove a 1% uptick in the Waste Management Inc. stock. Obviously, this is oversimplified. You'll never be able to actually work out what drove it, right? But if that was what drove it, a 1% uptick in Bill Gates' stock, which would mean it went from like 159 a share to 160 and 59 cents a share. Like it's not hard to imagine this happening, right? But if that happened overnight, Bill Gates would pocket $55 million to his own personal net worth. And that's if you look at one holding in his share portfolio. So if I circle back to where I started with this, are there people who are making heaps of money by pushing these narratives? Yes, I believe there are. And Bill Gates is one of them.
Yeah. And this is, like you say, it's just one part of his portfolio because he's heavily into Beyond Meat, isn't he? Or some sort of fake meat?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely had a big holding in Beyond Meat. I think it might be the case that he actually sold out of Beyond Meat and he might have seen the writing on the wall because their share price was absolutely tanked, which is, I think it might be the market talking back to them saying nobody wants to eat this stuff. I don't know if that might be part of it, but it hasn't gone well for Beyond Meat. But yeah, he's definitely involved in those alternative farming. He's got a heap of farmland in the US. He's actually just announced an investment in an Australian company, a startup in Australia that is working on reducing the methane emissions from cows, like, stock burping and farting. And, this is going to be the thing that's going to answer all of our problems. So he's actually in Australia at the moment. He's just announced a big investment into that.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts as to what his plan is to do with the farmland in America? And is he involved in the closing down of farms in the Netherlands at all? Does that benefit him?
Yeah,
somehow?
I don't know. I could definitely see why people speculate about that. I don't know why he would want to. I guess I can think of several reasons, but I'm not sure which one it is why he would want to control all of his farmland. It's not unusual. If you take it at its best, it's not unusual for someone with a large amount of wealth to store some of their wealth in land holdings. So you could take it at its best and say, well, he just thinks his land is going to be valuable, so he's buying it up. I think that's probably very generous. It doesn't really fit with my personal opinion of his character and outlook and his ideologies. But I've got no evidence to the contrary. I guess I'll say that.
Do you have any thoughts on Gates' relationship with Warren Buffett? They're supposed to be buddies, but yet Warren Buffett is buying fossil fuel assets, et cetera. And I'm just curious if you think Buffett has bought into this stuff?
Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? Because, Buffett actually gives a lot of money into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as well. So I don't think he's directly given funds to that organization, but I think he's given them a large holding of Berkshire Hathaway stock, which then is up to the Gates Foundation to do with as they please. So he's enriched that foundation anyway. So it's one of those things where the two narratives don't quite gel, do they, Tom? Like, it's not quite. No. There's some inconsistencies, and I'm going to touch on inconsistencies for a second. Bill Gates has just come to Australia, right? He's flown his private jet to come down here to have a little stay on Lizard Island, which is on the Gold Coast, which is, like a resort island, So he's flown over to this resort island. Then he's gone to Sydney. He spent 5 days in Sydney talking to a fairly influential Australian think tank called the Lowy Institute, which is where he announced this Australian investment I was just mentioning. And then he's gone down to Melbourne to watch the Australian Open tennis tournament for 5 days. So I like to say, like, your movements don't match your mouth. We're talking about how bad this is going to be, and the emissions and the carbon and all that sort of stuff that he's scooting around the world on a private jet. And when it's actually funny, when they opened the interview with him at the Lowy Institute, I said, what are you here for? And he goes, holiday mostly.
Really?
So like this is we're talking about, like, common sense, just checking these things. The people who are pushing these narratives aren't acting like they're true, are they?
No, I'm very pleased to see that Gates is getting so much pushback on Twitter over this. Tons of pushback over, why are you flying this private jet if you actually believe this narrative? So
yeah, and it's almost a bit of a lazy critique, isn't it, Tom? Like, we go, everyone's gone to Davos, they're all in Switzerland, they've all flown their private jets, but then on the other hand, they have all done that. And it is somewhat ridiculous, that they are flying around the world on private jets, spewing out carbon emissions when their talking points are all about how we need to reduce it for the sake of the planet. It doesn't add up, doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's a lazy critique, but I think we need to keep saying it, because if they actually believe that this CO2 is going to kill our kids, then they would not be flying. They clearly don't believe it. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have thoughts on what's going on with Elon Musk? In terms of, does he believe it, or what is happening in his mind? He seems to be all over the place, expressing some sort of skeptical thoughts, and he's making so much money, of course, off of the hysteria. What do you think? Yeah,
this will not play well on social media, Tom, or anywhere else. But again, I'm going to say I'm not sure. I'm sort of reserving judgment on Elon Musk. I think his takeover of Twitter is one thing. He's definitely reinstated some alternative voices that were banned from that platform before. And so he's done some things that he can point to and paint as him being a hero of kind of like the liberty and free speech and that kind of movement. At some points, if you look at like his interactions with the Bitcoin community, he's rubbished the energy use by Bitcoin miners, but then that, did that play into him making money in other ways with certain other investments in that crypto sphere? I'm not really sure. So I don't know, man. He does things where I go, yeah, this is brilliant. I'm really happy about this. And then at the same time, I think, I'm not sure I trust this dude. But I don't know. I reserve judgment.
Were you following him back in the day when there was this whole idea they were making a lot of money with credits for swapping out batteries? You were gonna drive your Tesla into a bay and it was going to automatically put in a new battery. They made a ton of money off of this. And I don't know if they ever did it in real life. And then now nobody ever talks about it. It's just another little bit of shady past, I think, for Tesla that they were making money. Yeah.
That one's new to me. I'm looking that up as soon as we get off this call. That's fodder for another article.
Yeah, that might have been 10 years ago or so. Anyway,
I had something here on my little list of talking points that I think might help people sort of like understand the perspective that I'm bringing to this thing. So I mentioned that I had some experience in money laundering investigation. So like I've investigated a lot of money laundering, and we're talking big sums of money. And I would say that there is many ways to clean dirty money as there are to make it, right? Like you can get very creative in how you launder your ill-gotten gains. And there's a lot of different ways to do it, but you can pretty much break them all down into 3 stages. I wrote a piece about this that's on my website as well. It's called information laundering. But basically your 3 stages of money laundering are placement, layering, and integration. I'll get in a little bit to what those 3 stages are so that I can sort of like draw some comparisons. But the point that I'm going to make overall is that same system, that same 3 phases of placement, layering, integration, you can use to clean up dirty money, and you can also use to clean information or to obscure the original origin of some information and make it look completely legitimate. So if I go through the steps, and I can kind of like briefly touch on how it looks in the money laundering world and then how it might look if you're trying to do it with information, this might make a little bit more sense. But this is just kind of like a framework that occurred to me based on, my experience when I started looking at some of this stuff. So if we go, the first stage is placement, right? So say you've got a whole big bag of cash that you've generated, however you've generated it, right? Like physical hard currency. You can't just walk into a bank with 2 duffel bags full of money or a suitcase full of money. It raises questions, right? So that first stage of the money laundering process is for a money launderer is, how do I get this money into the financial system? How do I place it into the financial system, right? So there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but one of them might be to dish it out into smaller chunks to a whole group of people that would in the industry would call them Smurfs. And you get these Smurfs to go around and just put in a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, and into various bank accounts, and then we put it all together later, and then we go into the next stage, right? Or maybe you commingle that cash into the proceeds from a legitimate business. So it's a little bit harder to pick apart, which of this is drug money and which of this is from a legitimate enterprise, that kind of thing, right? The equivalent stage for someone who is trying to obscure the origin of some information and legitimize some information would be like the research paper. So the very first point where someone decides, okay, I've got this idea that I want to put out there in the world, so I'm going to write it. I'm going to somehow create a veneer of authenticity for this. The first step is to get someone to write a research paper. Anyone could fund it. There could be certain interest groups who want to fund the research that ends up in this paper. But if they just then produce the paper paid for by the very people who are going to benefit from it, it's going to be pretty see-through, right? It's pretty paper thin, and we're all going to poke holes in it pretty quickly. So you're going to have to do something to legitimize it a little bit, right? So stage 1, if we're talking about money, it's to place them. It's placement, so it's about getting cash into the financial system, right? And stage 1, if we're talking about information, is usually the research paper or, the first time a university looks at it, something like that. The second stage is to start layering this, right? And this is the most important stage. The layering stage of this process of laundering, whether it's money or it's information, is to obfuscate where it came from. So we're going to make it hard to follow the trail to get back to what was the actual origin here, what was the very first impetus for this thing, right? So in terms of money, what this usually means is like rapid transactions. We're going to move it through a lot of accounts. We'll move it across country borders. We might switch it from one currency into another, put it into a cryptocurrency, buy something with it, sell that thing, you know what I mean? Just make the trail hard for anyone to unpick and go back. If you apply that same kind of thinking to like an information laundering operation, you might have like the research paper comes to a panel and a working group and they talk about it. And then, for example, the G20 meet and the G20 talk about it. And then they hand it over to another organization who do an opinion piece on it. And again, we do a 0 draft and we do all this sort of other stuff. It's just like steps and steps along the way so that a paper refers to another paper and refers to another paper. And then we've got all these steps where it's hard for the average person to pick back and work out where did this thing start, right? Once you're far enough away from the origin, you get into this integration stage, right? So if it's the case of money, you've now got your dirty funds, you've placed it into the financial system, you've taken it through a million steps, you've layered it a bunch of times. And then you've got to the point where it's quite hard to pick back. And then what you might do is take that money and buy like an income producing asset. Like you go and buy a business, right? And then take a big loan against the business. And like when I wrote this article, I made the joke, like you buy a big house near the beach with your loan, and you park your nice SUV and your boat in the driveway. You kick back and you live a nice life. You laugh at the suckers who are going to work 9 to 5, and then you use the money coming in from your income producing asset that you bought to make the payments on the loan, and you live happily ever after, right? And no one knows that that is all the end result of some dirty funds that started way back at the start of this process, because we can't pick back through all the layers and prove it, right? If you go to an information laundering kind of idea, then, there's the point where, like, I'll take the G20 as the example. So the G20 met in Bali recently, and once a year they have this summit, right? So in an average year, the G20 have about 200 meetings. And so there's all these working groups, various streams, and they all put together their little recommendations and drafts, and they add things on, and new reports come in, and things get flicked off to consultants on the side, and we get all this, it all builds up and builds up. At the end of the summit, they have this declaration, right? So I ran some numbers on the example of like the last Bali G20 leaders declaration, right? It's 19 pages of like virtue signaling rhetoric, which includes stuff about the financial system and about health generally, but it also, like, relevant to what we're talking about here, has the word climate in it about 600 times, right? Like it's all through, it cuts across all of it, right? So all of this climate related, mitigation and all this sort of stuff is all in there. So 19 pages in this declaration that is like the result of all their work over the years. Anyone actually reads it, which is hard work in itself just to get through those 19 pages, because they could do it a ghostwriter. It's poorly written. Get through your 19 pages, right? And then you get down to the back and there's 24 documents annexed to that 19 pages. And then if you start clicking into those documents, you quickly find another 23 annexed documents on top of that. So you got one 19-page document. You got to read 23 annexed documents to understand the first document, but then you got to read another 25 documents or 24 documents to get an understanding of what those 23 documents that were annexed to the main document were. And so you start to see this same model, right, of all these layers where you can't possibly get back to the start of it, because it's like those 48 documents you just read only got you 3 layers deep. And if we're involved in something that's been evolving for years and years, various philanthropies, various like supranational groups all chipping into it, all pointing to, referring to like the Paris Agreement and referring to all, COP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, all of these previous conferences and all the recommendations that come out of them. And then what the people get is the talking head on the TV at the end, who just give you a couple of slogans and a soundbite and a 19-page document if you really want to read it. And so to me, it just made sense that like that same way of looking at this, like 3 stages of money laundering, is actually the same 3 stages of information laundering. And it's the same way that they, paint this veneer of authenticity over this kind of information that they put out there.
Okay, very interesting. I hadn't heard it explained that way before. I like that a lot. How do you think we can kill this off?
Man, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Like, how can we just poke a hole in it? What we've got, I think, is like a stunning degree of complacency amongst people, and I think people are naive and they're ignorant. And in some cases, I think we're too busy, and people still trust the TV far too much. You know what I mean? They still trust what the newsreader tells them or what the algorithm feeds them. People aren't thinking critically about these things. And I don't think for the people in the rich parts of the world, if you're in the US, if you're in Australia, if you're in like a wealthy nation, the cost of living crisis hasn't pinched enough people yet. You know what I mean? Like all these things that we're doing that are driving up costs. Fuel is so much more expensive. Food is getting more and more expensive. All these kind of what appear to me to be direct knock-on effects of what we're doing with energy policy. Those things aren't hurting people enough yet, and they're not waking up and they're not sitting up. Once people are awake to it, the next challenge that I think they're coming up against, and that's why I was excited to get the chance to come on and talk to you today, is that like people are overwhelmed by that complexity we were talking about at the start. And I think there are a lot of people who can dive into this stuff and read it and get a little bit deeper into it. But I think there are a lot of people who are just overwhelmed by the prospect and don't know where to start. And so if there are people, like yourself, Tom, who can put a message out there that's sort of like, simplify this down a little bit to the point where a lay person can understand it a little bit more easily, it becomes more approachable and get more people into the conversation.
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned before, I don't think we need to go all of these layers deep and understand all these different working papers. Like, I think Tony Heller is doing a great job of pointing out
Yeah.
that the weather is not getting worse. Throw all this other stuff out. We've been emitting CO2 all this time, but why isn't the weather getting worse? I think we should harp on that too.
I think you saw I posted something on Twitter a few days ago that was sort of like, there's scientists who will tell you that, that the climate change is man-made and it's a threat to our society as we know it, it's a threat to the planet. And there's scientists who will tell you the opposite. And, if you form an opinion on that, how did you decide which group to believe? And I think that that's like a really relevant question to ask people, because unknowingly, there's this real mass-driven narrative that if people haven't thought about it, their baseline is to accept that, climate change is a genuine threat to the planet, because that is what they're being told repeatedly. It's been hammered home. And if they're not aware of the fact that that manipulation is going on, then they just default to that space, So you get all the people who are like not deliberately trying to work it out, who will just default to the other side of the argument. I was reassured to an extent, and I know obviously it's a very biased sample. The people who read my Twitter are probably of a certain mind, but there were a lot of people on there just saying, look, it's common sense. Stick your head out the window, look outside, everything's the same. There's a track record of these people and groups making these, doomsday predictions that just haven't come true. So maybe we could stop believing them.
Yeah, I do think, as you say, a big factor is that in the rich countries, we're so rich that it hasn't hit hard yet. But when they start taking away our right to eat meat, and once they take away our right to fly, et cetera, don't you think people are going to push back and they're just not going to let that happen? Or is the public still going to just say, okay, and let these restrictions last? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there will be a growing body of people that will push back. My concern is, how long will it take for most people, and how manipulated will they be? How much could they be deceived away from, like believing the evidence of their own eyes? Like, how far could they be pushed? I'm not sure. I was in Australia through the whole response to the COVID situation, and what we got in Australia was massively high compliance with vaccines, massively high compliance with like QR codes and people being tracked and checking in and having movement passports and all these sorts of things that went on down here. And to me, it was very surprising to see the extent to which people did not push back. I know there's other parts of the world where that happened, and maybe I would be more optimistic if that was my lived experience. But I've got to say, I'm concerned. I think a lot of people are, they have been brainwashed, for want of a better term, and they will listen to what their TV tells them. And I think we need to be better at producing a counter narrative.
Yes. What do you think is going on in the boardroom or whatever at Exxon? Do those people, are they actively in favor of climate hysteria because they can make money from it somehow? I'm constantly hearing that the people like me are funded by Exxon, but I'm not seeing any evidence that they are helping skeptics out. I haven't seen that.
Yeah, Tom. Once you've been labelled as controlled opposition, you've made it, man. So this is great for you. You've obviously reached that level. I'm happy for you.
Thanks.
What's going on at the boardroom at Exxon is, what's going on at the boardroom at Mobil or wherever. These separate bodies that are there to make money. They are capitalist institutions, and I think they will just make the most of whichever version suits them best. I think that, an example is like Andrew Forrest I think he's the second richest man in Australia. He's like number 70 in the world. I think we're talking like something low $20 billion, $23 billion personal wealth, something like that. He owns a huge mining operation called Fortescue Metals Group, FMG, which is the main iron ore producer out of Australia. They've actually just cracked the biggest quarter for iron ore exports ever shipped in the December quarter of last year. So like the coal mining game is going real good, right? But at the same time, we know that mining is going to play a big part in any sort of like energy transition. If we're going to need all these rare earth minerals, the same miners can make a lot of money digging up various types of earth and doing different things with it, right? So, if I take him as like a capitalist who's going to, as an example of a capitalist who's going to make money from this, one way or the other, he's at Davos sitting up there talking about the importance of this transition. He's got one company that's going to produce things that will benefit from a clean energy narrative, and he's got another one that's pumping out coal and shipping it to China. So I think these big corporations are not too fussed about acting on both sides of the narrative to make money.
Do you think there are leaders, maybe unelected leaders like Bill Gates who would like to see all the little people first pushed into electric cars and then shut off our access to electric cars using central bank digital currency. It looks like there are people who would like to control us to that level, or they only let us buy a certain amount of meat or maybe zero amount of meat because they have control of the currency. What do you think about those ideas?
I think if you asked me that question 5 years ago, I would have scoffed at you and thought you were crazy. And now I do not. Now I don't think that's crazy. I think we've got too many things that have all lined up that make that seem like the most plausible explanation for what's going on. I think there's a question to be answered about what is in the minds of some of the people driving this. So you will find people who will say, like, on a spectrum, right, who will say, I think Bill Gates is trying to save the world. And then there's the people who say, well, maybe he's got a bit of a messiah complex and he wants to save the world and what he thinks he's doing is noble, but the intentions are okay, but the outcomes are not going to be okay. They're going to be really bad. And then you go one further and you've got the people who are like absolutely convinced that this is the devil incarnate and he is doing everything he can to destroy the earth. And I don't really know where to place him on that. I don't know the man personally. I think all we can do is, I like to say that you should judge people on their intentions and you should judge absolutely everything else on the results. So it doesn't really matter in the end whether these things that, some of these people are pushing are well-intentioned or not. What matters is that it's going to cause a lot of misery and destruction, and we should resist it for those reasons.
Do you have any handle at all on the magnitude of the money spent on the climate scam per year globally? Any idea what that number is right now? I'm hearing people throw out numbers like we have to spend $40 trillion to solve this problem, but I don't really know how much right now is being spent on this.
Yeah, I'd struggle to put a number on it. I think anyone would struggle to calculate it. It's so big, and it's without going down a whole different rabbit hole. It's not really the focus of your podcast, but like fiat currency and governments having the ability to print money out of thin air and just create more and more of it to fund these things that are justifiable by what might be just laundered information, as we talked about earlier. The amount that could possibly be spent on it is absolutely endless. It's enormous, and they're talking about numbers that are more than like global GDP. There's huge numbers we're talking about spending on this thing, and you justify it by saying that the planet's going to burn down. It's one of the things that they will work on to kind of justify this huge spending. Once a year, the World Economic Forum dropped this document called their Global Risks Report. They just dropped it. Usually it comes out shortly before the summit, shortly before the dirtbags all meet at Davos, as I like to say, before they go up there for their little jamboree. So they dropped it this year, and they've got this chart in there that's the top 10 risks over a time period of 10 years. So that they have one in there for like over the next 2 years, the next 2 to 5 years. But this is their chart for the next 10 years, right? I'm looking at it right now. So the 10 risks in order. Number one, biggest risk to the earth, to the world, in the next 10 years is a failure to mitigate climate change. Number two is the failure of climate change adaptation. Number three is natural disasters and extreme weather events. Number four is biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. Number five is large-scale involuntary migration. Look, I won't go on, right? If you look at this document, what they want you to believe, this is like the result of much resource and much research and much laundering, in my opinion, and a lot of layering went into this. But we're in a world, Tom, that holds the potential for nuclear conflict, for like hot wars, for mass civil unrest, for almost certain financial system collapse. And these people pushing this report out want you to believe in the next 10 years, the biggest threat is that the sun might get a bit warmer.
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. Like I've said before on Twitter that when I was a kid, I had ideas of what the future would be like. The future is just way more stupid than I thought it would be. I can't believe it's this stupid.
We've really evolved, haven't we? We've come a long way.
You're probably not aware of this because it's a local issue, but I'm here in Minnesota in the U.S., and I'm just looking at a headline here that the Minnesota House just approved a bill setting a new benchmark of 100% carbon-free energy by 2040. So I'm sitting here, it's 8 below zero right now, Fahrenheit. It's really cold, the days are short, and we're going to try to power this place using carbon-free energy. That is incredibly stupid, as you know. It's amazing. This has got to be peak stupidity. Yeah.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Yeah. I mean, if they actually did that, a large percentage of us would die pretty quickly.
Yeah, it just doesn't stack up. It won't work.
Do you want to mention at all that little Twitter thread you did about a tale of two countries, one eats bugs, one doesn't?
Yeah, beautiful. Give me a second. So just talking about this, the world's shortest tweet thread, 2 tweets about what I described as a tale of two armies. And this probably ties in pretty well with us just like talking about, without understanding all the nuance and the scientific detail of all of these issues, you know what I mean? Can we just common sense it? So imagine there's 2 armies and one army gets fed carrots and bugs and run all their equipment on solar power and batteries, right? And that's how they're going to fuel and feed and arm themselves, right? And then the second army eats steak, drinks milk and run their fleet on diesel and jet fuel. And then inevitably what is going to happen is that one day the second army decides to deprive the first army of their homeland and resources, right? And then the first army can do nothing about it because they're too weak. And, you know, like kind of the point that I was making in this like somewhat lighthearted and very shorthand way is not everyone in the world is going to play these games, right? Like, so if we take like the most obvious example of China and look at what they're doing with their energy production, they're making solar panels and parts for wind farms and all these sorts of things that obviously they're manufacturing using hydrocarbons. They're not manufacturing those things by using solar and wind energy, right? And then they're selling them to the rest of the world. We're becoming reliant on them for the production of, you know, the equipment that we need to try to make the power that we need using those unreliable sources. And then the profits they're using to build more coal-powered power factories. So like this doesn't really make sense, right? If you continue along that road, one part of the world, you know, the part of the world that does not put a premium on like cheap, reliable, abundant energy and all of the things that flow from that, you know, that part of the world gets weaker while another part of the world gets stronger and stronger. And eventually they just come over and they take all your stuff. You know, like it's a national security risk, right? As much as anything. So I think that's kind of a point about trade-offs that we don't really talk about enough, where we say, oh, well, we'd like to have this beautiful green energy, you know, oasis type narrative. But even if that's possible, even if you do that, not everyone will do it. And the bully will come and take your things at the end of the day. That's kind of the point.
That is a great point to wrap up on. Anything else here?
No, I think all I'd say is that thank you, Tom, for what you're doing and, you know, trying to shine a light on all of these issues. I think they are important. Some of these things bothered me before I had a kid. And, you know, now I know that whatever we do with the world, we're going to hand on to the next generation. I've gone from being a little bit annoyed to like furious and trying to do something about it. So I think anyone who's shining a spotlight on these issues is doing noble work and we need more of it.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for the work you're doing. And I hope to have you back on again sometime if you have some more time. But thank you very much.
I'd love to. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you. We'll talk to you next time. Goodbye.
Cool. Bye.